Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition here of Point of View. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics over the next couple of hours. So if you can kind of dip in and dip out, or if you can listen to the whole broadcast, I hope that you will do so. You may want to go back if, of course, you have a busy life too. I understand that. You don't have the ability to sit there and listen to radio all day, but I do want to highlight some things we will be talking about so that if you don't have a chance to hear it, maybe later on you can go back to our YouTube channel or go back to the feed and find some of this, because this hour we're going to spend just a little bit of time, first of all, talking about Texas, because we have some very good examples of election fraud that happened in the state of Texas. And so that's kind of a Texas story. A little bit of an update on what's happened in the Texas legislature. We won't spend a lot of time on that because I know not every one of you is actually living in the state of Texas this hour, although this is what we oftentimes call our noontime Texas hour, because most of the listeners are. But even if you're not, these will relate to what is happening in your state. Then we'll get to the issue of impeachment. Of course, no surprise about the vote yesterday, but now we have a lot of knowns and unknowns, if I can paraphrase a former Secretary of Defense. So we're going to talk about what we do know, what we don't know, what we guess on, and of course also the fact that we have now more soldiers in the Capitol than at any time since the Civil War. That tells you a lot about the concern about any possible violence or any kind of insurrection, to use the favorite word everybody wants to use. And so you have National Guard troops sleeping in the Capitol Visitor Center. They're going to close down the whole aspect of the inauguration, so we'll get into that. And if we have time, and I'm pretty sure we will, we're going to talk about the fact that there's beginning to be a split in the Republican Party between people that like Mitch McConnell and people that have liked Donald Trump. Matter of fact, it's a very significant split, and also illustrative of the fact that we're about ready to see a major split in the Democratic Party, because once you don't have your common enemy, that would be Donald Trump, all of a sudden you're going to have the progressives wanting to just push things together, pedal to the metal. And you got some moderates, not a lot of them left in the Democratic Party, but just enough to say, wait a minute, we're going to have to run for re-election here. This is not going to work very well. And before we're all through, of course, we're going to be talking about the big tech push and the, if you will, the backlash to big tech. And that's just on this hour and a little bit of next hour. And then we will have at 1:30 Kent Edwards, CrossTalk Global, just talking about the importance of biblical preaching and teaching. And in light of really what I'm starting to see, even real tension and concern within the Christian community, you know, what can we do to really preach godly biblical messages to address some of those issues? So we're going to chat with him for a little bit about that and talk about CrossTalk Global and what they're doing not only in this country but worldwide. And then at 2 o'clock, mentioned it yesterday, but let me mention it again. We had just last Friday, somebody said, what about all those statistical anomalies about voting and some of these voting irregularities? Well, back in November, we had Dr. William Briggs on to talk about those, and I thought it would be time to bring him back on the program to look at those, because he pointed out all sorts of questions that came, especially with some of those vote dumps. So I'm going to give him a chance to say what I saw in November is still concerning me me here in January, or some of the concerns I actually surfaced in November. Maybe we found some explanations for it, so we'll see what he has to say. I honestly don't know all that he will say. I'm leaving that to him. And then I'll have an open line after that, just in case some people want to make other comments about the issue of voting irregularities. But while we talk about voting irregularities, let's talk about what is happening right now in the state of Texas. You don't hear a lot of people talking about voter fraud here because, after all, most of these elections are pretty significant. If it's close, that's when you get a lot of attention there. And even whether you're looking at the national election, because Donald Trump won by many more votes over Joe Biden, or even many of the senatorial election was pretty much a slam dunk. Even many of the congressional races, either the Democrats won by a lot or the Republicans won by a lot. And so in some respects, people have never really paid attention sometimes to the issue of voter fraud. That is changing, and due in large part to the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton. Yesterday, one of those individuals with Bexar County was seen originally on a hidden camera. That comes from James O'Keefe, who's been on this program before, and Project Veritas, in which she was boasting about, on this hidden camera, didn't know it was a camera running at the time, her mail ballot harvesting prowess. She's now been arrested and charged with multiple voting fraud felonies. Her name is Rachel Rodriguez. Some earlier reports called her Raquel. Her real name is Rachel, not Raquel, Rodriguez. She's been arrested for election fraud, illegal voting, unlawfully assisting people who are voting by mail, and unlawfully possessing an official ballot. When you add up all the charges, she could spend 20 years in prison if she's convicted. She is what many people call a ballot chaser. She was recorded, if you remember those videos coming out, and we've mentioned them. You probably haven't seen one of them on mainstream press. We've talked about that before. But she was recorded explaining how she and many of her associates pressure and even reward targeted voters in order to meet the vote totals that certain campaigns and candidates want them to reach. So it's a classic illustration of voter fraud. And she at one point boasted, now we'll have to see whether or not this was a boast or whether it was real, that she brought in more than 7,000 votes. Now, let me stop there for just a minute and recognize that, again, in the state of Texas, even 7,000 votes might affect a few races, a city council race or a school board race or something like. 7,000 votes would not affect the presidential election. But if those 7,000 votes were in, say, Nevada or Georgia, yes, it would. So you can see that when people say, there's voter fraud, it's just it's a big myth and everything. And matter of fact, we're going to suggest that anybody who argues that there's voter fraud is probably calling for an insurrection and probably is engaged in sedition. But here we have the fact that indeed it was the raw, unedited footage provided by Project Veritas that led to her indictment and probably now her conviction. Which again illustrates the point. As I've said before, the reason we don't see a lot of voter fraud even being prosecuted is, first of all, it's difficult to discern. Second of all, even when you get a conviction, it's oftentimes just a misdemeanor. And so if you're a district attorney and you know that even once you're finished proving voter fraud, it didn't affect the election, you're going to get somebody with a slap on their hand and walk away. Why are you even going to pursue it? And to his credit, Ken Paxton said, you know what, we need to make this an issue, and they are making this an issue. By the way, this is not the first one, in case you're keeping track, and I have been. Back in November, you have a social worker in what's Limestone County who was charged with 134 election fraud felonies after submitting false voter forms for disabled residents in a state-run living center. So there are just a couple of examples in the state of Texas. Do you think Texas is the only place where voter fraud has taken place? I really don't think so. And so it illustrates, again, some of the things happen even here in the state of Texas. And in the past, there was like, well, it doesn't affect any election, so why pursue it? I think it's a good idea to pursue it, because when you don't prosecute it, you get more of it, don't you? We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America is a house divided. That is the central message of the book by David French, Divided We Fall. His book was selected by World Magazine as its book of the year, and I had him on my radio program recently to talk about the polarization in America. He believes it is time for us to understand that the continued unity of the United States of America cannot be guaranteed. He persuasively argues there is not a single cultural, religious, political, or social force that is pulling Americans together more than it is pushing us apart. One reason for the division and polarization is geographical. More and more Americans are living in what has been called landslide counties. These are counties in this country where one presidential candidate wins by at least 20 points. Back in 1980, there were about 400 of these landslide counties. Today, there are more than 3 times as many. Another factor is the phenomenon called negative polarization. What this means in the political sphere is that a person belongs to a political party not so much because they like their own party, but because they fear the other party. When he speaks, he often tells his audience that if they can remember one thing, it is the principle from an obscure academic paper by a University of Chicago law professor. The daunting title is The Law of Group Polarization. You can summarize it by simply saying when people of like mind gather, they tend to become more extreme. When everyone in your group or in your tribe agrees with you, you become more convinced of your view and have less appreciation of the opposite view. David French also provides solutions, but I think we must take the first step to healing by recognizing that this country is truly a house divided. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that one of the issues before the Texas legislature is going to be this issue of mail-in balloting. There looks like there are at least 6 different bills that have been submitted there in the Texas legislature to expand absentee balloting. And so as a result, you're seeing some Republican bills that are wanting to prohibit any official from providing a mail-in ballot to an individual who didn't meet at least the statutory requirements. So this is going to be a battle, and I would think that the battle in some respects will be aided by some of these convictions that are starting to come down in terms of irregularities, in some cases fraud, in other cases questionable irregularities about how ballots are handled, especially when they go into a senior living center and help them fill it out and then take them, and all the other things that have been happening for some time. So that is a battle. And you might say, well, why would we go after this poor individual who actually has just been trying to help people vote? Well, because she was doing it illegally, number one. And because I think it is time to send a signal to say, you know, ballot harvesting and voter fraud, we've been always turning a blind eye towards it. And it's about time to say this has got to stop. And you know this only so well. If you don't ever have anybody pay a penalty for any kind of criminal activity, you know what happens. You have more criminal activity. Let's take it as a simple way. Have you been driving lately on the tollways or on 75 or 35, those of you in Dallas? You have seen people flying down there, and that's partially because we aren't ticketing enough people that are speeding. just the other day, I see this one car just fly by me, and I'm thinking, how fast must he be going? And I look down at my speedometer, and I'm going, hey, Bubba, you're going 80 miles an hour yourself. I didn't, even realize how fast I was going because I was just in the flow of everybody. And so when nobody gets ticketed and nobody gets pulled over for speeding, people run red lights and there's no consequences, what do you have? Well, you have what's out there in the streets right now. The same kind of thing that you have in terms of voter fraud. And that is, if indeed nobody ever gets punished for engaging in questionable activities, then you're going to get more of those. And so I think it's time to recognize that they may be actually doing a good service to voter integrity. And also, I think some of these prosecutions might be cited as the ongoing debates take place, because there's going to be raucous debates right now in the Texas legislature and in legislatures around the country about what kind of emergency powers are we going to give to the governor, to mayors, to county judges on the pandemic. What kind of mail-in balloting are we going to allow in various states around the country? And, of course, you're going to have all sorts of battles about redistricting and a number of other things. So, nevertheless, let's move on to the issue of the day, and that is the impeachment. This president now has been impeached twice. Half of the impeachments ever given to a president have gone to Donald Trump. What does that mean? Kind of hard to figure out exactly, because what you have is, of course, the decision by the Democrats and then by 10 Republicans to vote to impeach the president. Once again, remember, impeachment doesn't mean you're removed from office. Impeachment means you have a stain, if you will, on your presidency. But that is about it. And so the number voting for the impeachment for insurrection, 232, was more than those voting for impeachment on the basis of the phone call the president had to Ukraine, which is 229. But other than that, not much difference. Now, theoretically, it goes to the Senate. It's unlikely it goes to the Senate before January 19th, when the Senate reconvenes, and January 20th is Inauguration Day, so nothing really could happen until after that. And by that time, then you have two more senators, Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff, representing Georgia. So it would be more likely thinking that you could get enough movement to actually then have the Senate consider this. So this is the big question that many people are asking. What would actually happen indeed once that took place? If indeed you're convinced that the president is not going to actually have an impeachment trial in the Senate until the 20th, which seems likely, then why push it? Because if you go back and look at some of the other impeachment trials, most of them, the three, pretty much lasted 83 days. Of course, that goes back to Andrew Jack Johnson, I think, 37 days and 21 days, respectively. So I don't know that you're going to have one that's going to take place in a day or two, although they're talking about this idea of a snap impeachment. So that's a possibility, but pretty unlikely. And so there are some that are suggesting, well, it doesn't have to take 3 weeks or 4 weeks or all that amount of time. Matthew Continetti has said that the arguments put forward for idleness are not convincing. He says Democrats worry a trial might interfere with President-elect Biden's agenda, but the trial doesn't have to be long. He says all the facts are in evidence. They're plain to anyone who can read and watch television. Senators could reach a verdict prior to the inauguration. Indeed, it is best they do so, even if the trial concludes only hours after Biden takes office. Now, this guy's really pushing for it, but we'll see. There are just a lot of other ifs in that sentence, which assumes, first of all, that you could actually get some movement when, at least theoretically, you would have to argue that Mitch McConnell is still in control of the Senate, right, until the 20th or the 21st, because you wouldn't have your two senators from Georgia that are Democrats. You'd still have your two senators from Georgia that are Republicans. I still have a question about, well, what do we do with Kamala Harris? Is she both a senator and a vice president at the same time? Not a lot of people are even asking that question, but it's a good question to ask, and how do you resolve that one? But again, I just don't see how this happens, but nevertheless, there are some knowns and unknowns about this impeachment, and this time next week we'll know all the answers, and so rather than try to speculate, I think we'll just set that one aside and figure it out as days go on. Maybe Kelly Shackelford, who spent earlier this week in Washington, D.C., and I believe he was with the vice president. Maybe he's got some insight, and we will have him in the studio with us tomorrow to talk about that. Just before we take a break, and as I get into some other issues, let me just say that not only has there been so much unprecedented by actually now 2 impeachments in 2 subsequent years of the same president. That has never happened before. And the unprecedented nature of the assault on the Capitol. You also have the unprecedented situation that this is the first time we've had that many soldiers on the Capitol grounds since the Civil War. Now, you know why they were there in the Civil War. That was to protect Congress. It was to protect the President of the United States. But we've got just incredible number, at least 20,000 National Guard units, which have now been summoned to the Capitol. And now it's like sort of an armed camp, because these are individuals which are carrying rifles with them. They're standing at arm's length from one another. Why? Well, of course, that's social distancing. They have heavily armed military trucks, which are now blocking the roads. And the city is really almost like a perimeter of closed streets now. And so this, of course, comes after the attack on the Capitol last week. And the Secret Service began what it calls National Special Security Event Operations, getting ready for the 2021 inauguration on Wednesday. And rather than the early scheduled day, one day before that, they are going to be moving ahead there as well. If you want to look at some of the pictures, you've got pictures of National Guard sleeping in the hallways of the Capitol, which is something you've really never seen before. And then, of course, you have, I mentioned the National Guard, and I mentioned the Secret Service. Let me mention one more. You have the D.C. Police. That would be the D.C. Metropolitan Police. And the chief of the D.C. Metropolitan Police Force said that there's a major security threat. And so at that point, talking about that issue. And for those of you that are wondering, one of the articles that I have posted, which we will get to probably in the National Hour, comes from our good friend John Solomon, in which it's entitled Unanswered Questions About the Capitol Siege. We now know a lot more about the fact that there were warnings about the fact that there were individuals that were going to actually move against the Capitol. Pretty good evidence that some of those militant forces were actually heading towards the Capitol before the president spoke, certainly before he finished speaking. That was, of course, the justification for why to impeach him again, and I'll leave that conversation to later. But we're now learning a little bit more about some very significant threats that primarily were minimized. And to be fair, when you have people saying crazy things on the internet, are they just saying crazy things, or are they going to go and do it? Anyway, we'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the impact of that impeachment and then get into, of course, the great challenges that have come even in the last couple of days of closing down a Parler. And then it looks like now they've found a server that I think they're going to use the same servers as Rumble, if I remember right. And so that maybe they will be back up, but not anytime soon. But there is an interesting question that comes out of all of this in light of this impeachment, in light of the storming of the Capitol. On the Republican side first, and then I want to talk about on the Democratic side, what does that mean? And Gary Bauer the other day, who's been on the program with us many times before, he talks about a story that appeared in the New York Times. Now, he also hastens to add, now it's the New York Times, so who knows? Sometimes these stories get planted and there's no truth to them, but usually they're planted by individuals that are trying a trial balloon. And the New York Times story makes the case that the Senate Majority Leader, soon to be the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, has been backing this idea of a House impeachment, seeing it as a way to, quote, purge Trump from the party. And the argument that what we need is a reboot. And you are seeing all sorts of articles that have surfaced, and I've tried to read some of them. Sometimes I can't get past the first or second paragraph with all the vitriol that is made, but this how Donald Trump has ruined the Republican Party, and the Republican Party needs a reboot. Okay, so assuming that those people are out there, and they are quite vocal right now, and assuming that Mitch McConnell maybe agrees with them, Gary Bauer asks a very good question. What is the future model of the Republican Party going to look like? It's quite possible that Donald Trump goes to Mar-a-Lago and we never hear from him again. I doubt it, but you know how that goes. He certainly won't have the kind of platform. He won't have a Twitter account. So, there's just all sorts of questions. But Gary Bauer points out that if you look at one of the surveys, 70% of Republican voters see that the platform that came out during Donald Trump's administration, maybe not Donald Trump himself, but the platform should be the model for the future of the party. And yet, if you feel that you need to reboot, you're saying, well, we just simply need to get away from the things that Donald Trump focused on. And yet, where did he get those 80 million votes? He didn't get him because he had just such a winsome personality. As a matter of fact, I'm sure there are some people that may have even agreed with some of the things that were happening in the Trump administration, but they just couldn't get their head around Donald Trump's personality and either didn't vote or voted for Joe Biden. And so he says, the Republican establishment, this is Gary Bauer, he says reverts to business as usual, goes back to, he says, worshiping at the altar of free trade that sent our factories and jobs to China. As you might remember how much Donald Trump made China an issue, fighting endless wars we don't win because we fight by the ACLU's rules and open borders, pardon the pun, the party's over. And he says exactly who are the voters who these consultants think they will build a movement with. He says there aren't enough people in corporate boardrooms and country clubs to win elections. The entire, he says, hashtag Never Trump movement was never more than a number of well-funded Beltway consultants and pundits, oftentimes receiving left-wing money, and that was true about the Lincoln Project. And so he was given it the 70% number for Republicans, but I can do Gary Bauer one better. This just came out today, and this is a survey done by Axios. If you listened to my commentary yesterday, I mentioned one of the writers for Axios, so it's pretty much left of center. So they're not going out of their way necessarily to put any kind of right-wing bias into this, but the Axios Ipsos poll actually did a poll of Trump supporters and found that 91% of Trump supporters backed his contesting of the election. 96% say that some of the platform ideas and some of the ideas that Donald Trump surfaced made the Republican Party better, while only 51%, I should say, of traditional Republicans agreed with that. 92% of Trump supporters want to see him run again in 2024. Don't know if that's happening, but it was an interesting poll. And as you look down those numbers, then Trump supporters, only 1% said he should be removed from office and those kinds of things. So it illustrates that even if he is gone, and he may be by this time next week gone, not only just in terms of politically, but maybe even figuratively as well. And those ideas are still out there. And it's the person that embraces those, promotes those, that may actually have a platform to run again. So anyway, it's an interesting set of questions that are being raised right now about the future of the Republican Party. To be fair, there are a lot of people that are arguing that once Donald Trump leaves, even though there'll be some tension and understandably so, within the Republican Party about its future, the conflict between the Democratic Party will explode. And there are people that are saying that up until now, the one thing that held together some very loose coalitions in the Democratic Party was the common enemy, and that's, of course, Donald Trump. When he's gone, and we'll see how gone he'll be, and for a while they might even be able to say, we have to work together to undo all the damage he did, or however they will participate that. But there are a number of leaders in the Democratic Party that have made it very clear that they feel like they have 2 years. They can look down the road, just like we've been talking about here, and recognizing that right now, as I mentioned just earlier, we have reapportionment and redistricting, and we recognize that there are probably going to be more and more members of the Congress who are Republican coming in the next election. And that would be in 2022 and actually taking the office in 2023. They recognize that if they don't push quickly, there could be very significant backlash to some of the things they might want to do. And most importantly, recognize that they really want to change the rules about the filibuster, about the number of members of Congress, about the size of the Supreme Court, about all sorts of other things. Now is the time to do it. So you're going to have the leaders, especially of the right or the radical part of the Democratic Party, want to push like never before because they recognize that time is short. They also are wise enough to know that this time next year, people will already, I know it's hard to say, but people will already be talking about the midterm elections because they'll be talking about some of the primaries that will unfold about 13 months from now. And so they recognize that if you're going to get it done, you've got to hit the ground running, and there is every piece of evidence to suggest, indeed, that's what the Biden administration wants to do, and that's what the Democratic Congress wants to do. And they also recognize that it's the pottery barn. You break it, you own it. If there's a Democrat in the House, a Democrat in the Senate, and a Democrat in the White House, then you can try to blame Republicans, but, you know, that isn't going to work very well. So they're going to be pushing like never before. And then for the last remaining blue dog Democrats out there, Joe Manchin in the Senate and a variety of others in the House, they're going to want to put on the brakes sometimes, and the conflict about you're pushing this too fast. None of our members of Congress are going to be able to win re-election in the 2020 midterms and all the rest is going to explode because now they don't have the common enemy, Donald Trump. They instead have each other as enemies, and it could get pretty difficult pretty quickly. So if nothing else, that is just one more issue to put on the table. And I might mention, as we come to a break here, that I've posted a couple of articles on how big tech actually was able to take out Parler. And then I even go to a very good article by Glenn Greenwald, who is basically more or less a liberal, who also gives that argument. And so I give you the first one, which is from Mike Huckabee, but then Mike Huckabee quotes from Glenn Greenwald, so I give you both of those articles. We also have one that we'll talk about in the next hour on the pushback against big tech. But before this hour is up, I want to talk about some of these unanswered questions about the Capitol siege. But basically what you have here by Mike Huckabee is a 1, 2, 3. Number one, how did you get rid of Parler? Well, there was a memo going out suggesting that those individuals that were actually attacking the Capitol on January 6th were actually using Parler to plan, coordinate, and facilitate those activities. The evidence now is that none of them were using Parler. It's doubtful any of them maybe even had the app on their phone. But it worked to then give Apple justification by saying that they wouldn't distribute the apps of Parler because they may represent dangerous and harmful content, so they removed them. Then point number two is Google then announced that they would also not allow Parler to use its Play Store, which would be downloaded into Android phones. And then, of course, number three, very simply, when Amazon Web Services informed Parler that they would even terminate their web hosting service. So if nothing else, Mike Huckabee talks about the 1, 2, 3 punch that actually destroyed Parler. And if you don't believe that that was coordinated, well, I do have some swampland I want to sell you. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just mention this hour, and we will get into it in a lot more detail in the third hour from maybe about 2:30 on after we have William Briggs. This story that comes from John Solomon. And again, I appreciate John Solomon research. In some respects, he's doing the kind of thing you expect reporters to do. Anyway, this is Rush to Judgment. 3 crucial questions remain unanswered about the Capitol siege. And he reminds us of something I've said before. I remember years ago, and this goes back 3 studios, where somebody says, well, I want Point of View to be the first out with a story. And I'm going, not always. Sometimes first out is always wrong. And he gives a couple of examples. You know, back in 9/11, you know, the argument was as well, this completely caught us off guard. And then finally, we find out later that the CIA and FBI had significant advance evidence of the plot and the players, but didn't connect the dots. Of course, you have Susan Rice going out and saying that the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi was due to an anti-Muslim video. We knew at the time that was wrong, and we certainly know that that was now pre-planned and carried out by an al-Qaeda-aligned terror group true. And, of course, over these last couple of years, we talked about the Christopher Steele dossier, which was promoted for so long as actually something that showed that Donald Trump colluded with Russia, when, in fact, even the CIA and the FBI, we now know, knew that it was uncorroborated and based on Russian disinformation. So the bottom line is that now we are starting to hear that there was some information, and very reputable information, about the fact that some participants were planning a war on the Capitol. Actually, that included killing officers, and they were even distributing maps of the complex, and that they had actually alerted Washington, D.C. law enforcement. And so you have the prosecutor, the chief federal prosecutor, declared, at least on Tuesday, that he is pursuing conspiracy charges about these multiple actors and multiple conspirators. So John Solomon says, in light of this new information that has come out, he has 3 questions. Question number 1. How could Trump incite an attack that had already been pre-planned and was in motion before his speech ended? And again, that may be brought up in the impeachment trial. But if nothing else, one senior intelligence officer that he talks about found no evidence that the president or the White House or the National Security Council were even alerted in formal intelligence briefings to some of these warnings. Now, I'll be fair. I'm never wanting to criticize those in law enforcement, and sometimes it is so easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. And one of these writers said something that crossed my mind, and that is the FBI always has trouble trying to distinguish between someone writing, this is the quote, despicable things on the internet and are just practicing keyboard bravado, or whether they actually have the intent to do harm. You know, if I get an email that says, you know, I'm going to kill your wife and I'm going to burn down your house, I don't like getting it, but you have to assess whether or not that came from a 15-year-old upset by something I said on the internet, or whether it's somebody who has the means by which to do that. And I think that's the question the FBI has. So, first of all, it's a good question. We'll bring it up a little bit later, and I'm sure it will come up during the impeachment. How can you blame the president for even the words that he used that day when the attack took place before he spoke, or certainly before he finished speaking? Anyway, second question is, I think, a more appropriate one. What did House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the other leaders of Congress know? When did they know it about the possibility for violence and the Pentagon's pre-attack offer to send National Guardsmen to reinforce the Capitol Police? So apparently the Pentagon did provide that opportunity, and it was turned down. Now, the best evidence for what happened there comes from the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police, Stephen Sund. Now, you can remember that he's, of course, somewhat controversial because he was the one that Nancy Pelosi wanted to step down, and he did indeed resign. But nevertheless, he did tell the Washington Post that security officials at the House and the Senate rebuffed his early request to call in the National Guard. He also alleged that the House Sergeant at Arms, Paul Irving, was concerned with the optics of declaring an emergency ahead of the protest, and rejected again the idea of the National Guard presence. And he says the Senate Sergeant at Arms, that is Michael Stenger, recommended that he informally request the Guard to be ready in case they needed it for some kind of security. So again, why were those overtures of saying, hey, we can provide you with the National Guard? You know, the ones now sleeping in the hallways in Congress. Why were those rebuffed? And again, take this with a grain of salt, because this is a person that was immediately criticized by Nancy Pelosi and resigned. But it's a good question. He seems to suggest that there were people that just didn't want to have the optics of having a military force in the Capitol. And so as a result, to answer a question we've been asking around here, is it really that easy to take the Capitol on if you bring that many individuals there? And the answer is, apparently it is if you don't have the National Guard. The third question is, were the facilitators inside the Capitol and outside it who instigated or enabled the attack to be carried out? And this isn't one just raised by John Solomon. It was raised, interesting enough, by somebody I seem to be quoting almost every day, and that is Representative James Clyburn. He's a Democrat, African-American, by the way, but he is the longest-serving member of the House, very respected, and third in power there. And he first raised the question because he noted that the protesters were able to locate and penetrate his unlisted, unmarked office within minutes, really raising the possibility that they had inside help. I've only been through a Capitol tour twice, maybe three times, but the two that I remember vividly. And it is an old building, and there are all sorts of nooks and crannies. And I'm guaranteeing if you don't know where you're going, there's no sign that says James Clyburn's office. There's no sign that says Speaker's office. Oh, that is a little easier to find because it's off of course, the Statuary Hall. But still, you can get lost in that building real fast. I remember one time they were taking us down at one point, and they're saying, now, this is where the U.S. Supreme Court used to meet. And I said, I never knew that the Supreme Court used to meet in the Capitol. It's a real small area, and it's set aside, and there's no sign showing that or anything. Unless you have a docent sharing you around, you have no idea where you're going. And so in addition to this, John Solomon raises something that people have raised before, because we do have some video that shows officers and other people opening doors to rushing rioters, and some people purported by the filming cameras to be leftist anarchists smashing windows, urging protesters to jump into the Capitol. So anyway, these are some questions, and I think they're good questions, and they deserve answers. And John Solomon raises those in light of some of the facts that are starting to come out. So I wanted you to hear that now, because we won't talk about it again for about 2 hours. And it is our last article on the website, so that you can kind of read some of the statements, some of the facts, and then the three questions that John Solomon raises. I think they're all legitimate questions, and so they deserve to be asked, and they deserve to be answered. Anyway, we need to take a break, and when we come back, let's, if we can, get into the National Hour. Then we're going to be talking with our good friend Kent Edwards, Dr. Kent Edwards, and Dr. William Briggs. I guess both of them have their PhD, so we got to give them the doctorate there. And we'll be talking a little bit about teaching and preaching. We'll be talking about some of the statistical irregularities of voting, and I might just mention my Viewpoints commentary today, which I've been talking about for some time, is entitled Divided We Fall, and it is based upon the interview and the book that we talked about last week with David French. You will find all of that on the website, pointofview.net. Take the time to print it out. Take the time to post it on your webpage, on your Facebook page, and send it on to others. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed. thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition here of Point of View, and over the next couple hours, we're going to spend some time really getting into a variety of different issues and looking at it in different ways. First of all, let me just mention we will talk about the impeachment, the second impeachment of Donald Trump, and what some people are calling the knowns and the unknowns. We know what the vote was, but we don't know what happens now in the Senate, so we'll get into that in just a minute. And, of course, also just a striking fact that most of us thought we would never see. We have more soldiers now in the Capitol area than at any time since the Civil War. And so we'll talk about what that might mean in order to prepare for what might be an assault once again on the Capitol. One would hope not, which also brings me to one of the articles which we will get to next hour in more detail. But we now are starting to find out a lot more that this was not a spontaneous riot. It was planned, that the initial reports are wrong. No surprise there. And that some of the individuals now, one of the federal prosecutors even pursuing conspiracy charges against multiple actors and multiple conspirators working in concert with one another. And this leads to, of course, a series of questions by John Solomon. One, of course, is the question, if all of this began before the speech was even given by Donald Trump, how can that be used in the impeachment? We'll see if that comes up later. Second of all, what did the leaders there in the House know, and even on the Capitol police know? And so we'll talk about some of that. And then were there possibly some facilitators inside the Capitol, even some outside, that allowed this to take place, which is not just a question raised by John Solomon, but also by Representative James Clyburn, who is a Democrat, African-American from South Carolina, actually the longest-serving person in the House, third in power. He raised some questions in which he points out that the protesters were able to locate and penetrate his unlisted, unmarked office within minutes. And if you've ever been in the Capitol, maybe had a tour through there, you know how many convoluted hallways there are and everything, and how they found the Speaker's office and all sorts of other things. It's really some very good questions, but we're going to postpone some of that to the next hour. But it's a very important series of questions that we will talk about. We'll also get into the attack by Big Tech on Parler. I've got a very good piece, which is our first article by Mike Huckabee. And also Mike Huckabee quotes a great deal from Glenn Greenwald, who I quoted yesterday. So I also put the Glenn Greenwald article up there as well from Substack, so you could read the original story. And then there's one by our friend Michael Brown on the pushback against the tyranny of Big Tech. So we have all of that to cover. And then the bottom of the hour, Ken Edwards will be with us. Dr. Edwards is an individual we've talked with before about the importance of good biblical teaching and preaching. And at a time when there is so much turmoil and there's so much tension, what can those of you that are in the pulpits, those of you who are teaching Sunday school classes and others do to begin to address all of the issues unfolding before our very eyes biblically? And then the next hour, we're going to bring in Dr. William Briggs. If you were listening on Friday, one of the callers said, what about all these statistical issues that relate to voting irregularities? And I mentioned at the time that we'd had Dr. William Briggs on in November, and he'd highlighted some of the concerns from a statistical point of view about these vote dumps that many of us have seen and seen the graphs for and the charts. So I thought it was about time to bring William Briggs back and say, okay, do you still stand by some of the concerns you raised back in November? Have you discovered others? Have you also found that some of the concerns you raised there maybe have been answered by some of the various states? So we're going to spend some time talking with William Briggs about that, and that will be our primary focus. He, by the way, has a PhD in statistics from Cornell. Has been kind of the leaders on this whole issue of the statistical irregularities of some of the vote, especially as it relates to the difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But I also, before we let him go, also want to get some thoughts on the whole issue of the pandemic and the lockdowns, because you might remember that he, along with Dr. Jay Richards and Dr. Doug Axe, have written a book that relates to the whole issue of the ineffectiveness, if you will, of some of these lockdowns and the concerns about the tremendous cost that those actually have enacted from our society. So we have a lot of things to talk about, and we will certainly be doing that here on Point of View. Let me now get to the issue of impeachment. Of course, we all know the vote took place yesterday. I'm not going to go into it in a lot more detail, other than to recognize that you had a few more people voting for it this time, which has then given a lot of people a chance to say, well, it was bipartisan. Well, maybe a little bit. 232 Democrats and 10 Republicans in total voted to impeach on the basis of inciting an insurrection. And to put that in perspective, when the vote took place last time on the president's phone call with the president of Ukraine, it was 229 and 230, depending on which article you look at, of impeachment. And now, of course, it goes to the Senate. Does it go this week? Well, it doesn't look like it, because the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is still the majority leader until about January 20th, maybe even a little bit longer, because the only change will take place once the votes in Georgia are actually confirmed. Many people believe that will happen next Wednesday, the 20th, which means then on maybe January 21st, assuming everything works, that you would then actually bring in a Senator Warnock and a Senator Ossoff. But until that time, you still have two senators from Georgia that are Republican. You also have Mitch McConnell as the majority leader. And then, of course, even when you have this change, you have a 50-50, which would still not necessarily suggest that Chuck Schumer has complete control. Because you have to ask, okay, what about Kamala Harris, Senator, Vice President? Can you be there at the same time? Good question. Not going to get into all those issues as well. But nevertheless, the question is, could you actually have a fast impeachment? And although some are arguing for that, let's at least remind ourselves that we've had 3 other impeachment trials. One lasted 83 days, one lasted 37 days, the most recent one lasts 21 days. So there are some that are making the case that this could go faster. Matthew Continenti says, we don't have to necessarily see that this would interfere with President-elect Biden's agenda. The trial, he says, doesn't have to be long. All the facts are in evidence. They're plain to anyone who has read or watched television. The senators could reach a verdict prior to the inauguration. Well, that presupposes all sorts of things that don't look like they're going to happen. But anyway, just wanted to mention that, yes, the impeachment has taken place, and now it's become almost perfunctory. We can remember, at least those of us that are old enough around the table, to a time when an impeachment was something you couldn't even imagine. It was for the most grievous of actions. And first the impeachment of Donald Trump, then the even before that, the impeachment, I might as well go back to Bill Clinton, then the impeachment of Donald Trump, and now the second one. These 3 of the 4 almost seem incidental and insignificant. But nevertheless, there are soldiers at the Capitol sleeping on the floors, ready for the next assault, which we pray will not take place. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America is a house divided. That is the central message of the book by David French, Divided We Fall. His book was selected by World Magazine as its book of the year, and I had him on my radio program recently to talk about the polarization in America. He believes it is time for us to understand that the continued unity of the United States of America cannot be guaranteed. He persuasively argues there is not a single cultural, religious, political, or social force that is pulling Americans together more than it is pushing us apart. One reason for the division and polarization is geographical. More and more Americans are living in what has been called landslide counties. These are counties in this country where one presidential candidate wins by at least 20 points. Back in 1980, there were about 400 of these landslide counties. Today, there are more than 3 times as many. Another factor is the phenomenon called negative polarization. What this means in the political sphere is that a person belongs to a political party not so much because they like their own party, but because they fear the other party. When he speaks, he often tells his audience that if they can remember one thing, it is the principle from an obscure academic paper by a University of Chicago law professor. The daunting title is The Law of Group Polarization. You can summarize it by simply saying when people of like mind gather, they tend to become more extreme. When everyone in your group or in your tribe agrees with you, you become more convinced of your view and have less appreciation of the opposite view. David French also provides solutions, but I think we must take the first step to healing by recognizing that this country is truly a house divided. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention we're going to have Dr. Ken Edwards with us at the bottom of the hour, and then at the top of the next hour we have William Briggs, Dr. William Briggs. And if you've always said, okay, I've got some real questions about this vote, and interestingly enough, there are a lot of Americans that still are wondering about the election of 2020. He's going to help us with the statistical issues. Now, that's different than all the other allegations. We'll talk about some of that tomorrow with Kelly Shackelford, because he knows the lawyer that actually filed the case for Georgia, who then was pushed out of her own law firm. So it just shows you the kind of cancel culture taking place right now. But let's talk about the canceling of Parler, because the first article I've posted here is a very good piece by our good friend Mike Huckabee. We're even talking about maybe bringing him in for an event in the future as a speaker. He's a good friend and used to listen to Point of View when Marlon Maddox was the host. And he calls it 1, 2, 3, How Big Tech Coordinated to Take Out Parler. He spends a fair amount of time quoting from and using some of the facts and figures from Glenn Greenwald. And so the second article I've posted actually is the Glenn Greenwald article from Substack, which you can read in its entirety. It's very long, but it is entitled How Silicon Valley in a Show of Monopolistic Force Destroyed Parler. Now, if the name Glenn Greenwald rings a bell, and it should, he is the individual that we've talked about who calls himself, by definition, left of center. He is. He did not vote for Donald Trump, probably disagrees with a lot of the various policies of Donald Trump, but has been horrified by the censorship from the big media and the big tech. And what is so interesting is he actually years ago with some other colleagues started an organization so that they wouldn't find some of their investigative reports censored. And then when he began to speak out about the fact that the social media was censoring the story by the New York Post about Hunter Biden and his laptop, and then started even deleting posts by the President of the United States calling it misinformation, he really began to write some pieces, and his, if you will, co-authors or, various coordinated individuals in that organization just kind of said, maybe it's time for you to go. So he's really out on his own right now, but he notes that if nothing else, this is really ironic because the people behind Parler, he says, has done exactly what the social media giants have always said. What did they say? If you don't like the rules we impose, then go start your own platform and make your own rules. Okay. Matter of fact, my wife and I walk every day, and I cannot count the number of times my wife has said, why don't they start some other alternative platform? And I said, well, you got Parler and Rumble, and you got MeWe, and got all sorts of things getting started there as well. So actually, Parler said, all right, put up or shut up. We'll put up, and we'll go out there, and we will establish a platform. And Parler succeeded. Matter of fact, succeeded so much that was the #1 app on the App Store. That's when everything came down. So let's count them 1, 2, and 3, because all of a sudden, #1, there was a letter from Apple that was circulated, which actually talked about having received numerous complaints and accusations that the Parler app was used to plan, coordinate, and facilitate the illegal activities in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021 that led to a loss of life, numerous injuries, and a destruction of property. And so, again, you can read all this on our first post, so you can read it for yourself. And by the way, I'll give you the bottom line there. The first 13 people arrested, not one of them even used Parler. Matter of fact, I'm not even sure they had Parler on their phones. But okay, so this was a false accusation right off the bat. But this leads to #1. So if you're going to count them down, 1, 2, 3. #1, the next day after this had been released onto BuzzFeed and others, Apple told Parler that it wouldn't distribute their app any longer because they represent dangerous and harmful content, and thus remove them from the App Store. Then, just to actually rub salt in the wound, if you will, Dorsey, head of Twitter, then took a screenshot of when his became #1 after, of course, you take Parler off, which had been #1. So that's the first issue. #1, Apple took Parler off because they were distributing apps that could represent dangerous and harmful content. #2, then Google struck by suspending Parler from its Play Store, thus severely limiting the user's ability to download it into Android phones. And then I'll go to #3 real quickly. Amazon then delivered the third blow by informing Parler that its web hosting service was being terminated. And so all of a sudden you find that they don't have an app that anybody can get or that even works. And #2, they don't even have a web hosting service. And that actually was the end of that for the moment. By the way, I might just point out there's some evidence that suggests, I think I'd heard that Parler is now going to be using some web hosting services that use Rumble. So they will eventually be back up, but nevertheless, as Mike Huckabee likes to say, ding dong, the First Amendment is dead, and maybe for a few days at least. And again, a lot of this was based on a false rumor that Parler was used to coordinate the attack on the Capitol. Next hour, I'm going to go into that in more detail with the research by John Solomon, which is really pretty significant, and the 3 questions he asked. But if you're one of those people that wants to read ahead, it's the last article we've posted. What would be, I guess, the 4th article on the website that you can read ahead of time. But let's also acknowledge that if there is some calls for violence on Parler, those pale in comparison to, now this is the fourth page here, explicit calls for violence that are rampant on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, which is owned by Google. The Capitol breach, as far as we can determine now, was planned largely on Facebook and Twitter by members of QAnon. And as far as we can find, no participants have been found that were active on Parler. Lest you disagree with that, again, go to the Glenn Greenwald piece, in which he at least points out that of the first 13 arrested for the Capitol Hill violence, a total of 0 were active on Parler. So there's where we have seen kind of a shutting down of one free speech platform. What has been the reaction? Well, that gets us to the third article by our good friend Michael Brown. I happened to quote him yesterday, The Pushback Against the Tyranny of Big Tech. And he, again, helps you understand that some of this almost seems coordinated. Seriously, if you think that Apple, Google, and Amazon all did this independently without coordinating, well, as I love to say, I've got some swampland I love to sell you because, of course, that is the case. Look at this timeline. And this one's in Michael Brown's piece. On January 7th, the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, called for big tech to ban Trump for life. And then the same day, Google and Apple turned their backs on Parler. And then, of course, we know, of course, the banning of the president. Lest you say, well, yes, but it's just the president and it's a few other people. Well, yeah, it's the former national security advisor. It's a lawyer that has been trying to uncover some questions about this whole issue of voter fraud. But then here it goes on to point out that on Monday, former Congressman Ron Paul announced that his Facebook account had been suspended after he linked to an article on his website criticizing big tech's overreach. He said, with no explanation other than repeatedly going against our community standards, they blocked me from managing my page. Then, of course, you know what has happened even outside of the whole issue of social media. Senator Josh Hawley had a book that was supposed to come out with Simon & Schuster called The Tyranny of Big Tech, but now that's not coming out. And then, real quickly, before we take a break, we have all sorts of world leaders. Al Jazeera, for example, isn't it funny that Al Jazeera reports that one of the spokespeople for Angela Merkel in Germany called the ban problematic and added that freedom of opinion is of elementary significance. The head of Mexico said, I don't like anyone being censored or taking away from the right to post a message on Twitter or Facebook. I don't agree with that. I don't accept that. The son of the president in Brazil actually talked about Twitter being authoritarian and tweeting. These are all things that you can find. England's Boris Johnson called for an even-handed enforcing of the rules. And then you even have one of the Russian opposition leaders, Alexei Navalny, called the ban an unacceptable act of censorship. So there are other people joining in their condemnation of this. And, of course, I mentioned yesterday ACLU and a variety of others. So this isn't a Republican versus Democrat or a liberal versus conservative kind of issue. There have been a lot of people that have been harshly critical of the big tech censorship. Well, we'll have more to talk about that. When we come back, we're going to talk with our good friend, Dr. Kent Edwards. How can Christians speak to these important issues? And we'll talk about that with him right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, one of the things we've been talking about for some time, even last week we had David French on talking about his book, Divided We Fall, and that is my Viewpoints commentary today. I've got another one coming out next week about the division and polarization. The question I want to try to answer in this half hour, if we have the opportunity, is how can godly men and women who are in positions of spiritual leadership speak to some of these issues and speak to this polarization that takes place? And it seemed to me that one individual we need to bring back to the microphone is Dr. Kent Edwards, because he is with a group called CrossTalk global.org. We have that website there as well, and he really has had a desire to preach God's word for all of these years. And well, first of all, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the organization, because we did cover that years ago, a year and a half ago, I guess it was, and it's good to have him back on. He is, of course, also a tenured professor of preaching and leadership at Talbot School of Theology in Biola, has a master's divinity from Tyndall Seminary, a doctor of ministry from Denver Seminary, a doctorate in intercultural education from Biola University. But he, if nothing else, can maybe give some of you that are in positions of teaching and leadership some ideas about what we can do. And as you go to his website, you'll notice that one of his latest podcasts is There Is No Sin So Great That We Are Not Capable of Rationalizing It. Or we could change that to this idea of polarization. There isn't so much bias that we can't necessarily negate our bias as we're pointing out somebody else's bias. So I thought this would be just a very good conversation. So Dr. Kent Edwards, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's great to be on.
Let's, if we can, briefly talk about your organization, because I want individuals to know what you have been doing in terms of really educating individuals, making available to all sorts of pastors, literally around the world, world-class education so that they can be the best communicators of God's Word. But talk a little bit more about what you've been doing, and then maybe how the pandemic has kind of slowed some of that down and caused you to rethink how you're going to deliver some of that.
Well, CrossTalk has been going now for 7 years, and really the response has been astonishing. So greater than I would have ever expected. We are now in 8 countries across 4 continents. We're being invited to go to many more countries. There is an enormous hunger by the church around the world to learn how to understand and effectively communicate God's word. There just is. I think I had mentioned in our last conversation that according to the Lausanne movement and the Center for World Christianity, 95% of all Christian leaders in the world have had no access to formal training.
Yes.
So, as much as I support and encourage people to be involved with Bible schools and seminaries, there's been a 95% failure rate in equipping the leaders of Christ's church around the world. And so we're meeting that need. We're coming with non-traditional education, traveling to where they are, teaching them. And the pandemic has, at least temporarily, changed how we are working. So hear me well. I believe that if you are teaching someone a skill, that is best done in person.
Right.
I think we see that. Every sports team that you know of has multiple coaches. Nobody ever got to the Olympics by watching YouTube videos. So, which doesn't mean that distance education through the internet can't be valuable. And so we've been using that. We know that the way to train biblical communicators is by coaching. As we work with small groups of people in depth, and we're doing that. I meet with instructors around the world every month. We have at least a 2-hour Zoom meeting while we work through passages and develop their skills. And our other leaders are working with small groups of students doing the same thing. That has enormous benefit. So we'll continue to do that. But Kerby, one of the things that's interesting is when you get outside of North America, you find people don't really respond well to distance education.
Yes.
In fact, there's not much hunger for it.
Mm-hmm.
The world turns on relationships. So we've put a moratorium on starting new works until after this COVID-19 becomes more manageable. And but we are working hard with our over 400 students and alumni all across the world, continuing to develop them because we have a relationship. We know each other, and we can build on that. And it's really working well. We're really pleased with the progress that we're having.
Let's kind of talk about what people can do to help you. And a couple things come to mind. First of all, I know that a lot of our listeners here maybe have been involved with some kind of mission work, and maybe they have been able successfully through their church or maybe even individually to plant a church in some part of the country. And they're thinking, you know, the pastor is about 1 week ahead of everybody else in the congregation because he has never had any Bible training, and he's just one step ahead, and that's all. And sometimes I say that's all you need to be. I sometimes say when people go and I said, well, I couldn't do evangelism. Right now, you know more in your head about how to share the gospel than most of the people that you would be working with in some of these small churches, probably. So that is the case. So first of all, there are maybe some opportunities where people already know of a church or an organization or a mission outreach that would benefit from your work. Number two, like you said, you need some laborers for the harvest. So maybe there's some people that have been pastors for years, and maybe they're gifted in teaching or preaching, and they didn't know that this organization exists, and they could come alongside you. So what are available as opportunities for some of our listeners?
Well, I would say if you have a passion for or connections, strong connections with a country, with a region, let us know. We're happy to build relationships. But keep in mind that we are not a traditional mission. So we are radically different. Mm-hmm. Our goal is not for Americans to try and fill all the needs around the world. I believe that everywhere God builds his church, he gives them the gifted, godly people to help that church come to maturity. Our goal is to find those people and to equip them so that they can equip others, and they can equip others. We train trainers. So, for example, in Romania now, we started our first work in the country of Romania. It has grown. Our graduates, a number of them have become very effective instructors in their own right. We are going to be expanding in the next couple of months into Ukraine. And no North Americans are going to be involved in the teaching.
That's the way it should be. Yeah.
Yes, of course. And so I would say if you're interested in getting involved, we'd love to have you at whatever way that works. But get in on the ground floor, because our goal is for none of us to be needed.
Well, and also they, as I said just a minute ago, they may know of a church that has a need for training, but they also may have met somebody along the way in their mission outreach that is, if you will, kind of a rising star that is just unbelievably gifted. And you could say, I think this guy's already kind of a 10-talent person. We just give him a little bit of wheel alignment here and there, and you're going to really see him have an impact. So these are just some ways I think people can really help you. And again, if you find yourself saying, absolutely, I'd like to know more about this organization, it's called crosstalkglobal.org. There's information about, of course, their goals and their beliefs and some of the background, and then the various places in which they are doing ministry. And then there's a whole resource section that I wanted you to see, because those are some opportunities for you to kind of see what they do. And of course, most importantly, if you want to give to this great need, because as we point out, 9 out of every 10 people involved in some kind of teaching of God's Word don't have the kind of background that you have. I've said before that some people say, well, I haven't learned very much. Look, if you've been in a Sunday school class for a few decades, you got basically a Bible education, and you have much more. And so don't count yourself off. When we come back from the break, though, Kent, I thought we'd talk a little bit. Your latest podcast kind of struck me because there is no great sin that we are not capable of rationalizing, and what oftentimes referred to as the biggest mistake. And it does seem to me right now, and Jesus talks about that in the Gospel of Matthew, of people that are hypocrites, that we are so focused on the speck in another person's eyes that they don't see the beam in our own. And I think that's part of the division issue that we're dealing with right now, and bias, and it's a concern that we're starting to see surface more and more. And so maybe you can give us some thoughts about what a teacher, even in this country or overseas, because we are certainly dealing with the stress and the concern and the division and all of that that comes from the pandemic and the lockdowns and all of that. So I want to get some of your thoughts about that. And most importantly, we're all praying that there'll be a time when this opens up, because we want to send Dr. Ken Edwards and everyone else overseas to train those trainers to fulfill the Great Commission. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Ken Edwards with us for a few more minutes. Let me just mention, as program note, top of the hour, we're going to have Dr. William Briggs, and we'll get into some of those issues with him. If you are not familiar with CrossTalk Global, you can go to crosstalkglobal.org or simply go to our own website, pointofview.net. But Dr. Edwards, let's see if we can maybe prepare our listeners even in the United States, but this certainly applies to people in other countries as well. There seems to be a lot of division that is taking place. Also, some people wondering about persecution. Now, I'll be honest, you are and have many times ministered in churches that are in countries where it's persecution with a capital P. I don't want to overplay that here, but it does seem to me that there are some needs that can be addressed. And so as you're teaching various students about the whole issue of homiletics and preaching. What would you say to some of our pastors listening, some of our Sunday school leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, life group leaders that say, I want to prepare my congregation for what's going to unfold in the future? Do you have some thoughts?
Well, I would say that they are critical for our nation moving forward. I know that every time that God wants to rescue a nation from moral decay, that he has always chosen not to send a politician or a social worker or a lawyer. He has chosen to send preachers. You see that in Isaiah 6. The country was in disarray. They had lost their leader. They didn't know what to do. And God said, I need someone to go and speak my words. Who will I send? And Isaiah said, as we need to be saying, send me. Look, we're in a time where people are denying truth. I am shocked at the inability to say that something is true today. People want to hear perspectives. They want to hear alternate facts. But as preachers, with the power of God's word, we have the truth. It's the only reliable source of truth. I think we need preachers now more than ever to have the skill and moral courage to open the Bible and speak God's words, to bring truth to people who are desperate for it. And I think that's how God changes a nation. I mean, think back to the 1700s. America was in bad shape, founded by Puritans to be a city set on a hill, an example for others. But by the 1700s, morality was awful. More children were being born out of wedlock than with the benefit of parents. Alcoholism was rampant, so bad that many pastors couldn't even find their way to the pulpit on Sunday morning. But one local church pastor by the name of Jonathan Edwards, on July 8th, 1741, stood up and preached a sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and that started the Great Awakening. That spread throughout New England. It had such a dramatic effect that the moral transformation of America was absolute. In fact, some historians have called it the most glorious and extensive revival of religion and reformation of manners that the country has ever known. I mean, what has made America the great nation that it has been? It's people like Jonathan Edwards, and he's been followed by people like Finney and D.L. Moody and Billy Graham. When God's word is powerfully proclaimed, its power transforms lives, and transformed lives transform countries. So do you sense my passion?
Very good. And it kind of reminds me of a quote that you have, I think it's on your webpage, but it was from John Stott. Preaching has an unbroken tradition in the church of nearly 20 centuries. And yet, sadly, as you well know, we've kind of gotten away from that. It's more almost like a little counseling session. And yet, if I go back and read 2 Timothy chapter 4, it talks about preach the word, be ready in season and out of season to reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. It seems to me that these feel-good, quote, sermons aren't exactly what you're calling for, are they?
Absolutely not. No. It's amazing. Now, there are passages in the Bible that are very encouraging.
Very true.
We want to say what the Bible says, but it's amazing. The Bible was written to give us information we could not figure out on our own. Right? And people call for common sense. Well, common sense will send you to hell. We need more than common sense. We need God's perspective on how to live life. If we don't have that, we are lost. Yes, that means the gospel. Absolutely, it means the gospel. It means more than the gospel. It means that we not only understand the content of the Bible, but we apply the content. We live what we have learned. If we don't do that, then, we're not a light on a hill. We just, we're like a Pharisee. One of the things that scares me the most is that in Luke chapter 4, Jesus is being tempted by Satan, and Satan quotes the Bible accurately.
That's right.
Knowledge of God's word is wonderful, but that's insufficient unless there is application. So I think today that we need people in the pulpit, in the classrooms, in the small groups to have the courage and the ability to effectively communicate what God is saying to us. We need that. I would also say that our people need to be involved. In Acts chapter 19, it is fascinating to me, this chapter. I think it speaks directly to our day. In Acts chapter 19, Paul is in Ephesus. And Ephesus, as you know, was a very wicked, idol-filled city. Prominent, influential, but filled with sin. Paul was there a year and a half, and he preached. He spoke God's word unreservedly, and it had an impact. So many people came to faith in Christ and lived the truth of God's word. They changed the economic reality of that city. They changed the economy.
Yes.
And when that happened, and you've talked about persecution, and I know there's persecution. Persecution happens whenever people see that you are different. Okay? That's when persecution happens. And when the people of Ephesus saw this group of Christians living differently, a riot broke out. Mm-hmm. They took them to the stadium. 20,000 seats filled with people, an angry mob shouting for them to be the Christians to be killed. Doesn't that ring bells for what we see sometimes on the news? And as that happens, it's interesting to note that the city clerk in verse 35, and your readers can look at that later, Acts 19:35 and following.
Yes.
He stood up and quieted the crowd and said, look, you have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. There's nothing, these people have done nothing wrong.
Good point.
So these people didn't come, the Christians didn't come preaching against every sin they saw. They came living lives that were morally transformed by God's word. They had such an influence that not only did they change the economy, but the city clerk, a pagan, stood up and defended them.
Just amazing. We're just about out of time, but it just illustrates again why we need to be preaching God's word. And again, we have a link to crosstalkglobal.org, equipping biblical communicators so every culture hears God's voice. And Dr. Kent Edwards, just thank you so much for that encouragement, and thank you for what you're doing. And let me encourage people to support your ministry in prayer and financial support, and to, first of all, visit your website. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We're going to take a break and come back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about what about those statistical anomalies and some of the voting irregularities. Last Friday in our weekend edition, one of our callers said, there have been all these statistics that have raised some questions about these vote dumps. And I said, well, we certainly did a very good interview back in November with Dr. William Briggs, and it would be a good time to get him back. And if you have been paying attention at all, I noticed in one of his commentaries, he said the other day, now my name is in every, or at least most probably, every suit that Sidney Powell has filed. So obviously his statistical issues have been used time and time again. We talked about some of that back in November, so I thought we'd see what he believes now in terms of looking at some of those statistical anomalies. And if nothing else, I wanted to spend some time first talking about that. As we have mentioned before, we've had Dr. Jay Richards on talking about the price of panic, and one of the other co-authors in that, along with Doug Axe, is William Briggs on the whole issue of the lockdowns and the impact that those are having. So we have a lot to cover. Holds a PhD in statistics from Cornell University. Is the author of the book Uncertainty. Of course, the other one, The Price of Panic, and he joins us now by phone. Dr. William Briggs, welcome back to Point of View.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
I might just mention, I laughed at this one. I do read your comments, and one of your columns talked about the fact that you said, one of the most hilarious things that's happened to me so far is the Dean of Research at Cornell Medical School, where I was once a professor of biostatistics, emailed to say I better not dare use a Cornell affiliation. The reason I laughed, first of all, that he would think that would be a big issue, but then your response was even better. You said, I told him I would be horrified to have anyone think that I had any ties to Cornell, and that he should write to anybody who thought so, copying me so that I could endorse his repudiation. It shows that, we're canceling book contracts. We're telling people that they're engaged in insurrection and sedition. And they're people that are supposed to repudiate the president and this whole issue of voter fraud. So anyway, I wanted to get into that. And back in November, you pointed out that there were some things that didn't look right from a statistical point of view, because all of a sudden you get these vote dumps. And whereas before Donald Trump was ahead, all of a sudden Joe Biden's ahead. What are you thinking now after you've been able to look at that over the last few months?
Well, there's been no change really in our beliefs or our conclusions. This only happened in certain states. Voting was stopped only in a few states on election night: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and a couple of others. And at that time, in all of those states, these swing states, crucial states, Trump was well ahead and looked to be, as he would emerge the victor, just as he did in 2016. But for some reason or reasons, each of these states decided to stop counting. They all supplied a different reason, but it was all at the same time. And then in the middle of the night, when the lights were off and people were gone, they started counting again. And at that time, they especially used the mail-in and absentee ballots and so forth and these other mechanisms. And all of a sudden, Biden vote or Trump's lead shrank almost immediately in like a couple of hour window. And it just progressed that way throughout the night and throughout the next day. when in several of these states, we've all seen that graph. It's sort of a famous graph where Trump is ahead, and all of a sudden at the last hour, Biden has supplied just enough votes to boost his total above Trump's, and where he never relinquished the lead. Very suspicious behavior in these votes. That's pretty much the same. There's been all sorts of refinements and looking at it. This kind of behavior in the states that did not or were not in any kind of dispute, for instance, like New York and California, everybody sort of knew these were going to go Biden's way for obvious reasons, and the same signals were not found there. And in still other states where Trump's lead was recognized and it was going to be large, those signals were not there. So it's very suspicious. Of course, it's not absolute proof.
Of course.
It's not absolute proof that there was any kind of manipulation being done. However, it was sufficient indication that investigation should be done. And, of course, as everybody now knows, it really wasn't. The people in charge of the election integrity were the same people in charge of investigating whether the elections were fraudulent or not. And so the outcome was really in little doubt what they would find. Basically, it was a stalling tactic on a lot of these people's parts. Between the election and between Pence and certifying the Electoral College votes, there was only 2 months. And this is an enormous effort. Unfortunately, not as coordinated as it could have been, but there was nobody to coordinate. This was done by a lot of volunteers, like myself and others. Weren't paid a thing. We were just out there trying to find out what was happening, and our efforts failed. You asked. There was a lot of people doing a lot of things. In an effort like this, not everybody's contribution was as valuable as
I was going to say that
other people's. It's just
some of those initial statements were made were just off the charts, but I've always found yours to be credible, and it I think makes the case that we mentioned the other day, in which Jonathan Turley, who's a Democrat, didn't vote for Donald Trump, but nevertheless said, "Look, as a professor of law at George Washington University, when I see that at least the Rasmussen poll says that 47% of voters wonder if there was fraud in the election, and 75% of those are Republicans." But even if you say, well, that's maybe kind of a right-of-center poll, Reuters has 16% of Democrats, 33% of independents agreeing with this. We need some kind of no-holds-barred investigation, if for no other reason, to give people confidence that it was an up-and-up election if it was, and if not, to find the problems so that it never happens again. Don't you think?
Well, I do. I also think that such an investigation is now extraordinarily unlikely.
Yes, I'm afraid so, too.
Of course, it would be nice to get it, but I don't think we're going to have it. And we really didn't need it, in the sense that voting fraud, especially at the presidential level, these elections, is well known, well documented. Many historians, for instance, believe that the JFK swiped the vote from Nixon in 1960,
yes,
with Chicago's Boss Daly putting the total over the top in the same kind of way that it was probably done this time in a few localities. And they're very respected historians, like Edward Lutwack, who knows more about coups and insurrections than anybody. He said that when Nixon realized what had happened to him, he decided not to press the issue. He decided, for the good of the country and harmony, that he would not contest the election. And Lutwack was sort of lamenting that Trump did do that, and of course it did increase disharmony. But I don't think that Lutwack's conclusion is correct, because if Trump didn't do what he did, most people would never know just how bad these elections could be.
We'll take a break. We have a lot more to talk about with Dr. William Briggs. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America is a house divided. That is the central message of the book by David French, Divided We Fall. His book was selected by World Magazine as its book of the year, and I had him on my radio program recently to talk about the polarization in America. He believes it is time for us to understand that the continued unity of the United States of America cannot be guaranteed. He persuasively argues there is not a single cultural, religious, political, or social force that is pulling Americans together more than it is pushing us apart. One reason for the division and polarization is geographical. More and more Americans are living in what has been called landslide counties. These are counties in this country where one presidential candidate wins by at least 20 points. Back in 1980, there were about 400 of these landslide counties. Today, there are more than 3 times as many. Another factor is the phenomenon called negative polarization. What this means in the political sphere is that a person belongs to a political party not so much because they like their own party, but because they fear the other party. When he speaks, he often tells his audience that if they can remember one thing, it is the principle from an obscure academic paper by a University of Chicago law professor. The daunting title is The Law of Group Polarization. You can summarize it by simply saying when people of like mind gather, they tend to become more extreme. When everyone in your group or in your tribe agrees with you, you become more convinced of your view and have less appreciation of the opposite view. David French also provides solutions, but I think we must take the first step to healing by recognizing that this country is truly a house divided. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Wanted to give you a chance to not only hear from Dr. William Briggs, but if you want to ask a question, of course, his name shows up on a lot of these lawsuits, and he's the one that did some of the statistical analysis. Let me try to come up with a counter-argument, see your response. One of the things that people have pointed out, and certainly a variety, Jim Jordan, for example, pointed out that if you look at the 27 contested congressional seats across the country, which in a sense Democrats were hoping to win, Republicans won 27 out of 27 of those contested seats. Now, the explanation might be, well, maybe there was ticket splitting, that some of the people who voted for the Republican for Congress didn't vote for Trump for president. Or another argument, sometimes people say, well, yeah, but Joe Biden got 80 million votes, and that's more than Hillary Clinton. Are those statistical issues of relevance? Because you've been looking at some of the vote dump. But what about some of these other comments that people have made?
Well, sure. Yeah, we've looked at that too, that kind of thing. It depends on the state and everything. You could either vote straight party line in a lot of places, or you could vote individual offices. So, yeah, I mean, this was all accounted for. Especially in Michigan, it didn't look like there was that kind of thing happening, meaning the dumps for Trump were still anomalously larger than what was happening for what some people call down ballot tickets and that sort of thing.
Yes.
So, yeah, it was there. I mean, we did look at all that kind of stuff, and it's still suspicious what had happened, especially this year where there were so many mail-in ballots being used and absentee ballots being used because of the coronavirus panic. was signaled well in advance. They should have been looking for this, but I don't think that the Republicans, I don't think they gave it their best efforts in protecting their candidate's interests. That's my opinion on this. But,
and to be fair, one of the cases brought from Pennsylvania went to Supreme Court, and Chief Justice John Roberts said, we're not going to take it, essentially, because the liberals weren't going to, and then the Wisconsin one was. So we've got a number of people who'd like to talk to you, and I want to give people a chance because, you've been in the news, you've been the one that did the statistical analysis. So let's head up first to Maine, and Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, yeah. Thank you, Kerby, for taking my call. Boy, it's been a long time. I haven't been able to get through for one reason or the other. I'm looking at this thing, and I like I was saying, I'm just a layperson, and as far as the elections go, I've never been involved in any way in an election. But when I saw this all happening and unfolding, I thought it was pretty obvious that there was some really shady-looking things going on. And then in the days and weeks following, when I was listening to different people talk about it, I kept on hearing over and over again that there wasn't enough evidence to really go anywhere with it. And now it's like too late. But it's like, yeah, the evidence is very clear. There's very clear evidence that there was major fraudulent activity. And it's just so depressing. And, I'm looking at the same thing with this Capitol rampage that I watched it and I listened to the president speak, and I'm looking at it, and it looks to me like there was Antifa people that were taking hats off of Republican people that were there and storming the
And we will talk about that later this hour, because that's the fourth article I've posted here by John Solomon, in which he's asked some very important questions about the Capitol siege. So we will get to that in just a minute. But what I hear you saying is that there was fraud, and of course there's always been fraud. This is not something new. Dr. William Briggs, matter of fact, even here in the state of Texas, we're prosecuting some individuals which were accounted for thousands and thousands of votes by fraud, which probably didn't affect the presidential election, may not have even affected a congressional election, but we've got to prosecute these people, or we're going to have more fraud in the future, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. There's two things. People say, when they reluctantly admit that the evidence should be looked at, they say, yeah, there was fraud, but was the fraud consequential? And I always answer, if it wasn't consequential, they wouldn't have cheated. Why bother cheating if you don't think it's going to do something?
That's right. Well, let's take another phone call here. South Carolina on the Good News Network. David, what are your thoughts for this particular conversation?
Hi, Kerby. Hi, Doctor. With the evidence that you have, Doctor, that you presented, others have presented about this election, would it be then outlandish for one to say that the election was stolen from Donald Trump?
No, it's not outlandish at all. In fact, as I said earlier, this is not the first time it happened. Probably in 1960, the same kind of thing happened to Nixon when JFK, or the forces behind his election, pushed the vote totals just large enough for him to win the state of Illinois. So this is not the first time it's happened. And if we're not careful, it won't be the last time. Because a lot of people are going to say now, if we don't uncover this stuff, and if we don't find out which of these accusations are real and which are probably maybe not as important, why should we vote? What's the point of voting if the elections are sort of predetermined and and there's not much we can do about it?
And that was a question about Georgia. We have a lot of Georgia listeners that said, should I even vote in the Senate races in Georgia, which took place last week, as you well know. And we've got to establish election integrity. Of course, you're talking about at the presidential level. I mean, I can give you lots of examples of voter fraud that I think have affected some senatorial races, congressional races. And frankly, just before this, the Democrats were actually howling about some of the fraud that took place in the Democratic primaries. It took a while to decide who won the Democratic primary in the 12th congressional district in New York. They actually had to redo an election out of New Jersey, actually get a mulligan, because because they couldn't sort that one out. And again, some of these don't make a difference if the vote is not close. I just mentioned a minute ago the prosecution of an individual that probably actually fraudulently brought in thousands of votes, but it didn't make any difference either in the presidential election because Donald Trump won Texas by lots of votes over Joe Biden, and John Cornyn won as well, so it didn't affect any of the major elections, but it could have affected a city council race or something like that. So that's important, but let me give a few more a chance to join the conversation here as well. So we'll go out to Alaska this time. KJNP. Ken, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Hello, Kerby. Met with you when you and Warren were up here in Alaska last time.
Well, thank you for calling. Yes.
Dr. Briggs went through the statistical anomalies in the swing states there and said, basically, well, of course, that doesn't prove anything. But I'm just wondering, if you use statistics, you usually, come up with evidence to assert a proof. What statistical test would be used?
That's a great question. It depends. It depends on the type of analysis. For instance, one of the big ones we did, Matt Brainerd, who probably a lot of people have heard of, commissioned a survey. In a lot of these states, people had mail-in ballots. And he asked people on the list that had mail-in ballots of these states, did you receive a mail-in ballot? And if they said yes, did you return it? Now, these people were all marked as not having returned their mail-in ballots. And so a lot of people said, yes, they did return it. And so these represent missing votes. And so what we did with that survey is we extrapolated from the sample to guess how many votes went missing for one reason or another, were never registered in the system, sort of voter disenfranchisement. And so, for instance, in Arizona, the total number of votes that went missing by this was more than enough, way more than enough, to overcome the Biden-Trump difference. In other words, if these were in Trump's favor, he would have easily won. And the same kind of thing happened in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. So this was a very big thing. And so other tests, it just depends. There's a whole variety of different techniques that you could use, and it just depends on the type of data and the question you're asking.
Very good. I don't know if you have to go, but we have to take a break. But I would love to ask you a question after the break on your book, The Price of Panic. Is that possible, or do you have another?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, well, let me keep you a little bit longer because there may be another question or two about voter fraud. But, of course, you, along with Jay Richards and Doug Axe, have written this excellent book called The Price of Panic. And I've even noticed that lately you've been talking about how this insanity has not only taken hold here in the United States, but in the UK. And I might just mention, if you find yourself, okay, I'd like to read a little bit more, and I'd like to go to his website. We have a link to his website. It's wmbriggs.com, or simply go to pointofview.net, and you will find the information about Dr. William Briggs. He's been kind enough to stay here a little bit longer. I want to ask him at least a question or two about the pandemic. And then we're going to get to some really important questions people are asking about that storming of the Capitol from John Solomon. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Okay, for final hour, let me just mention that some of you online want to also talk about the assault on the Capitol. And as you well know, but let me just mention in case some of you have not heard, the FBI admitted that it has received information ahead of the January 6th attack about some participants planning, quote, a war on the Capitol, which included killing officers, distributing maps of the complex. They also were able to disrupt some of the travel plans of some of the suspected troublemakers, and now one chief federal prosecutor in Washington is pursuing conspiracy charges, which of course gets to our fourth article, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. You know, if indeed this was a planned attack, how is it that the president's speech incited that? What did, of course, some of the leaders in the House and Senate know, including the Sergeant of Arms and even the Capitol Police Chief? And most importantly, were there any facilitators now being suggested that there may have been to find their way around? So we'll get to that in just a minute. But we still have with us for a few more minutes Dr. William Briggs. And let's go, if we can, to Rick in Florida. Rick, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Mr. Kerby, and thank you for having Dr. Briggs on. I just got a question. I don't understand why. You know, he seems convicted, Dr. Briggs, that you're convicted that this was a stolen election, I would say. And have you been on Newsmax or Fox News? Why is it gaining any traction? Why did it just kind of fizzle out?
Oh, you know just as much as I do why. I was on Newsmax, maybe 6 weeks back. I've been on innumerable radio shows, have articles written and so forth, but this was not something that people wanted to look into that much, not the powers that be. And now some of the Congress people are saying, you know, anybody who questions this election now ought to be removed. I mean, it's getting pretty bad, the censorship out there. So it's not going to be something people want to talk about or even will be allowed to talk about in polite company for very much longer.
Well, if nothing else, I hope some of our listeners to Point of View think about where they've heard Dr. William Briggs apart from Point of View, and that answer might be zero. So maybe it's worth listening to Point of View, because we've had you on in November, we have you on again, and I want to bring up one other issue, because you and Jay Richards and Doug Axe have written a very good book called The Price of Panic, and you changed my mind once I read that book, and you probably know where I'm going, and that is you have a series of charts that show when the lockdowns were implemented in the various states. And you've got a chart for all sorts of different states. And then you look at a couple weeks later to see if the lockdown made any difference. And I think most of us, and I think even Jay Richards said, he was like me, came into the idea that maybe there was some benefit to the lockdown. And so there was maybe some benefit, but there's a huge cost, which we have spent weeks, now months documenting. What you found out is the lockdowns really didn't help at all, and the cost, as we have already documented, is huge. What's your thoughts?
We looked at it by states. We looked at it by country. Lockdowns did nothing to improve the death rate. And not only that, you could argue an easy case. I argue this all the time. If you look at the deaths, the weekly deaths in the United States, every single January they peak. Every January they peak. And the reason they do, or any kind of death, is because we all go inside in the winter, and January represents the peak of the winter, and we start spreading these bugs around. The problem with lockdowns is it's quarantining the healthy with the sick. You don't allow people outside their house except for a few hours a day, especially in some areas like in England, which is just terrible. And you force everybody then in those few hours to go into the same big stores where everybody mingles all together, and then you send them home, and everybody is crammed inside their homes, and they start spreading the bugs around. Lockdowns make things worse. There was never any good reason to do lockdowns. There was never any evidence for it. The reason they were first proposed is because of a high school project, if you can believe it.
Yeah,
of a girl who had to do a high school project that showed she wanted to do a computer project, and her dad helped her out, and they eventually wrote a paper, got picked up by the World Health Organization, and that became the basis of all this thing. It's a completely nutty story.
Let me just mention that, again, we have a link to your website, because some people might say, okay, you're saying that, I want to see it for myself. And one that I might point you to is your piece that came out just about 2 days ago, UK Madness Level Turned Up to 11. And you show, I think, only so well the incidence of deaths and sickness and things like that over a long period of time. And you begin to see the peaks and valleys, which we always talk about. And so whether you look at the UK or you take all the different extremes, you have a country like, let's take Sweden, which never locked down, a country like Peru, which locked down so significantly there were military out on the streets preventing you from going even out into the streets. And do you see a correlation? No. And of course, first of all, as a statistician, you know that just because you find a correlation doesn't prove causation, but you don't even see a correlation. There's all sorts of data that is all over the place. And so to make the case, as I'm fearful that the Trump administration tried to make against and the Biden administration is going to be making for, is, as a matter of fact, right now we're seeing some members of what look like will be the incoming Biden cabinet. They're saying, well, the reason the lockdowns didn't work is they weren't stringent enough. Oh, Katie, bar the door for what that might mean in the future. Any final comments?
On the other hand, the Chicago Mayor Lightfoot and the Governor Cuomo of New York, in the past day or 2 days, they both said, maybe the lockdowns are causing more pain than they're worth. Given that Trump is now out the door, maybe the lockdowns are no longer politically necessary.
I did see that. Yeah. One more question from a caller in Texas. Bennett, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Kirby. Dr. Briggs, with the information that you were able to provide and with concrete stats, what would you suggest for the future? If you were in charge of taking your information and affecting change in our nation in the voting on the federal elections, what would you suggest is the biggest thing as listeners or point of view could do to affect and have an action point to do something to affect change?
That's a great question. I would say poll watching. Any kind of laws, local laws, regulations, and things like this that people can do to get the polls very closely watched and monitored. Also, try to eliminate this wide use of mail-in balloting and absentee balloting. It's just way too easy to cheat with these things. And, the voting is spread out over weeks, even months, as opposed to being just on one day. These are just ripe for abuse. So sort of having elections become regular again and watched very closely, those would be the two biggest things you could do.
I'd also add to it what's happened in your state legislature. I'm seeing that some legislatures now are starting to say maybe we need to have very clear rules that say that a judge cannot just arbitrarily change the rules about an election. Some of those are already there. Some of them are wanting to really rein in the issue of mail-in ballots and require absentee ballots only for those that are qualified. So I think a lot of the battle may take place in some of these state legislatures, and they're all now convened here in January. So let's see if we can get some changes bringing that about so that a year from now, when we start talking about some of the primaries in the midterm election, we aren't having the same kind of concerns and fears we had before. So, Dr. William Briggs, I appreciate you being on the program with us today. I appreciate you staying late. And if people find themselves saying, well, they'd like to get a little bit more information, you post a blog and you've got all sorts of articles that have come out about everything from critical race theory to support those who contest the election to the one I just mentioned a minute ago about coronavirus and just all sorts of other issues. So just go to his website and you can find that on our website, which is pointofview.net. So thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me back.
We will do it again. And some of you said, well, what about the statistics? Well, we wanted to give you a chance to hear from him. And, I think Rick was asking a good question. Who else is covering these stories? Well, we're trying to, and we'll do our best to try to cover those. But when we come back from the break, I see some of you want to talk about whether this riot was pre-planned. Well, the answer to that is, of course it was, because even now the FBI and a federal prosecutor are acknowledging that. And I think it illustrates the first point that I'll make before we take a break, and that is sometimes the first storyline is never accurate. You remember when we were told that 9/11 caught everybody off guard, and then later we found out that the CIA and the FBI had significant information about that, but didn't connect the dots? Remember when Susan Rice, who told the nation that the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi was due to an anti-Muslim video, when actually it was a pre-planned attack carried out by al-Qaeda-aligned terror groups? And how about the Steele dossier? Turns out that we know a lot more now, and it really raises some important questions. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. You know, Bennett, just a minute ago, one of the callers was asking what we should do, and I want to add one more real quickly, and that is to encourage any prosecution of voter fraud. I mentioned the one in Texas. We have this woman, I guess it's Raquel Rodriguez. Some people actually originally called her Raquel. I think her real name is Rachel Rodriguez. Anyway, she was surfaced in one of these undercover videos by Project Veritas Natasha. Remember, James O'Keefe's been on the program with us before, in which she actually boasted that she brought in about 7,000 votes. Well, she has now been arrested for election fraud, illegal voting, unlawfully assisting people who are voting by mail, and unlawfully possessing an official ballot. He's been talking about pressuring individuals to vote, and of course, some of this has been going into various homes and doing all sorts of things that are obviously election fraud. So again, I applaud anybody going out and prosecuting voter fraud. By the way, back in November, there was one social worker that was charged with 134 election fraud felonies, and those are just in the state of Texas, where it probably didn't make any difference. But that's the problem. It doesn't make any difference. So a lot of people go, well, why bother to prosecute them? Because if you don't prosecute people engaged in voter fraud, it will happen again. And so just thought I'd mention that real quickly. That's another action item that you might encourage your district attorney, your attorney general, to prosecute voter fraud when it's found. Before I take some phone calls, because I see some of you want to talk about this, point out that this article that we've posted is the 4th article, and I want you to read it in its entirety. Don't accept everything I'm going to say here. You can check it out because you can find all the references there. But the FBI has admitted that it received information ahead of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, that there were some planning a war on the Capitol, including killing officers and distributing maps of the complex. It alerted law enforcement through the Joint Terrorism Task Force Alert System, did disrupt the travel of some of those suspected individuals. And I'll be fair to say that because you see people, as one person points out, writing despicable things on the internet, are they just practicing keyboard bravado, or are they actually intending to do harm? But John Solomon asked 3 questions, and I don't want to get to some of your calls. Number 1, how could Trump incite an attack that had already been pre-planned and was in motion before his speech even ended? One senior intelligence official said that they had found no evidence that the president, the White House, or National Security Council were even alerted in these formal intelligence briefings about that. So this is going to be a question that may surface if indeed we do have an impeachment trial in the Senate. How can you blame the president for something he said when the attack took place before he even said it? That's a good question. Question number 2 that John Solomon asked is, what did House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other leaders in Congress know? And it turns out that there were some individuals that were offering at the time that they could have provided National Guard presence. And yet, again, the U.S. Capitol Police Chief, Stephen Sund. Now, remember, he's resigned, and he was criticized by Nancy Pelosi. So, okay, take it with a grain of salt. But he told the Washington Post the other day that security officials at both the House and the Senate rebuffed his early request to call in the National Guard. And he even says that the House Sergeant at Arms, that'd be Paul Irving, was concerned about the optics of having all those individuals there as well. So that's a real question. And the third question is not just one that John Solomon is asking. It was one that Democratic Representative James Clyburn from South Carolina asked, and that is, were the facilitators inside the Capitol and outside it enabling the attack? Because James Clyburn, he's African-American, as a matter of fact, the longest-serving member of the House. South Carolina, mentioned him a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, raised this question because he pointed out that the protesters were able to locate and penetrate his unlisted, unmarked office within minutes, raising the possibility they got inside help. And if you've ever taken a tour through the Capitol, you know that it's a Byzantine complex. Things have been built, and it's hard to figure out where everything is. It's not like you got a sign, James Clyburn here, Speaker's office over here. And there seem to be videos showing officers and other people opening doors and other things. So I want you to read in its entirety this 4th piece that we've posted on the website, and that sets up some of the questions that some of you have. So let's go first of all to the state of Ohio, WTGN, and Steve. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, Kerby, I wanted to thank you for everything you do. Been watching your show for years, and appreciate it, man, because you give the Christian angle. And also thank you for getting people like Dr. Briggs. Yes, there's people in our church, a couple guys that went to Washington, D.C., and they were listening to President Trump, okay? And then when he finished, they walked to the Capitol, which is 20 minutes away.
That's right. It's about 20, 30 minutes on a brisk walk in 20 minutes, 30 minutes if you walk slowly. And, yeah, it's already been taking place. So these are really two groups, as we pointed out last Friday when Dr. Merrill Matthews was in studio with us. Go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, they said it was over.
Yeah.
And there was no barricades around. And it's just awful. This is pre-planned, just like the election fraud. I mean, it happened with the 9 states election, and it happened in Georgia, too. I mean, it's just not good, Kirby. But I appreciate you exposing things, and now they want to impeach the guy again for, and like you said, he was talking and it was going on then.
Well, again, I will be willing to give grace to our people in law enforcement because, after all, sometimes it's hard to sort out whether somebody, if I see a threat and somebody says, I'm going to kill your wife and burn your house down, I go, okay, I should pay attention to that. But it could be they're really serious about this, or it could be some 14-year-old kid who's just, full of bravado. And so you don't always have the ability to sort it out. But the point is, if we're going to especially have an impeachment trial, and it's based upon this idea of incitement of an insurrection, and if you will, the insurrection and the storming of the Capitol happened before the president spoke. And then, as one person working here pointed out, that you have these quotes being pulled from what Donald Trump said, but they're not in context, in which he says peacefully and patriotically. You have the media having, I guess that's back to our favorite line, a narrative, and so any contrary evidence to the narrative is not exposed. Now, the point I want to make for those of you as we finish today, because we will have a full discussion of this tomorrow in our roundtable with Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews, is some people, as you share this, are going to go, where are you coming up with that? That's why I want to make available this article, because it's not John Solomon saying this, it's the FBI saying that they did have information about a war being planned on the Capitol, even killing people, distributing maps. You have a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor, now pursuing conspiracy charges about these multiple attacks and these multiple workers in concert with one another. One prosecutor talked about the planting of carefully constructed IEDs. So we have a lot more information, and if your local press does not cover it, then maybe you should stop listening to them, because if nothing else, as we've tried to say before, we want to be your trusted source. And even when other people won't cover these stories, we're glad to cover them. And we'll ask some tough questions tomorrow around the roundtable. But we're simply out of time. If you want to find some of these articles, they're on the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Hope that you will also take the time to contact maybe Dr. William Briggs. Thank him for his research. And we will see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151.